Hello everyone, and welcome. My name's Tammy Simon, and I'm the founder of Sounds True, and your host today for this Psychotherapy Master Class with Bonnie Badenoch, who will be presenting on the myth of self-regulation. The structure of today's master class is that Bonnie Badenoch will be giving us a training presentation, and that will then be followed by a question and answer session that I'll lead. Now, before I introduce Bonnie, let me take a minute or two to tell you about Sounds True's new ongoing series of psychotherapy masterclasses. Each masterclass will be free of charge and feature an expert, a researcher, or leader in the field of psychotherapy. You may not know that Sounds True for over 30 years has been publishing books, audio, and online programs with and for leading psychotherapists. We've also been supporting practicing psychotherapists with programs for continuing education and advancement. I believe this is an incredible and important time to be a therapist in our world. We need you. Our Psychotherapy Masterclass series is designed to serve you and give you valuable insights into a specific topic that's on the leading edge of the psychotherapy world. And because we can only cover so much in one masterclass, each will be followed by a larger training in the future. This year, we'll release 4 such trainings as part of a 1-year program called The Leading Edge of Psychotherapy. Please watch your inbox for more details about this exciting offering soon. Now, let me welcome Bonnie Badenoch to our first Psychotherapy Masterclass on the myth of self-regulation, how our inner community supports us every day. Bonnie, welcome.
Well, thank you, Tammy. It's delightful to be here and kind of fun to be taking on what may be a slightly controversial topic. At least the way we've phrased it about the myth of self-regulation. I might also call it about built for co-regulation would be another way to think about that. In our clinical work these days, there is so much emphasis on teaching our clients to self-regulate. And over the years, I've understood, of course, the importance of regulation because it has so much to do with the quality of our lives. But it's the self part of it that I've begun to question more and more via relational neuroscience and also understanding something about where we are in our culture today. So we're going to look at this idea that co-regulation may be a more accurate way to talk about what goes on for us than self-regulation. And we're going to begin doing that by looking at our cultural situation some and how we are so encouraged to move toward self-reliance and toward autonomy. And then after we've looked at the work of Mcgilchrist about that, then we're going to talk some about more at the micro level about how our neural systems are designed for ongoing co-regulation. So I got really excited about thinking about this more deeply when I ran into an article that was in the New York Times a while back by a man named David Bornstein. And the title of it was Teaching Children to Calm Themselves. And so that prickled me up right away because I think there's at least quite a bit of agreement in the community that we don't come with any kind of regulatory circuitry, but it has to be co-built with another person. So the idea of teaching children to calm themselves was kind of rubbed against me. But I read the article and it was a lovely experience because after his initial couple of statements that came from him about how these children, what it was about was some preschools in Kansas and Missouri that are Head Start preschools, especially for traumatized kids, and who, of course, struggle with regulation because they haven't had someone to help build that circuitry early on for them, generally speaking. And so it was about what goes on at that place. And so he would talk about it in terms of these breathing stars that kids can use and a number of other things. And then he said, and of course, pretty much as a last resort, they could also find a lap of a teacher. And I thought, well, as a last resort, or I think he said, if necessary, the lap of a teacher. So I went on to read the article, though, and it turns out Bornstein's really a wonderful observer and a wonderful reporter of what actually goes on. because this article wasn't about teaching children to calm themselves. It was all about co-building regulatory circuitry with these wonderful, wise teachers who really understood how much they were needed in an ongoing way, not even with the goal that these kids become independently regulated, but that the teachers go on being available for co-regulation as long as these children are with them, and then would support that throughout the children's lives as well. So it was a wonderful kind of article, it was a kind of microcosm of the way in society we view self-regulation and co-regulation. It's almost as though becoming self-regulated has almost like a moral or a, what could we say? There's some kind of primary value to becoming more self-regulated. And that people who need ongoing co-regulation, which I would say is all of us, are actually looked at with a little bit askance, like somehow they haven't, done their work properly or something like that. And so I want to turn toward this question of how did self-regulation get to be a primary value and almost like a moral imperative for us in this society. So that draws me to the work of somebody who I appreciate so much, and that's Mcgilchrist. He writes about the two hemispheres of the brain, not from the viewpoint of what each hemisphere does, because both hemispheres do everything, as it turns out, but he writes about it instead from how each hemisphere of the brain allows us to attend differently in the world, so that we literally create a different world when we are attending through one hemisphere or the other as the primary way. Now, what he'll also say, and we'll get to this in a little while, is it's the relationship between the two that's vital, but that we need to first understand what the two are doing before that relationship probably makes a lot of sense. So he talks about how our right hemisphere in us and in other mammals, and actually I saw an article all the way down to, I believe it's ants and cockroaches, actually have these two ways of attending to the world. So it's something that's been preserved throughout evolution as something that's so important. So our right hemisphere is designed to be in this present moment and to be attending to what's going on in the relational world, what's happening between you and me right now, Tammy, or you and me, all of you who are listening to this, what's happening right in that space, in this emerging moment. And so it's a very tentative, flowing kind of space where we don't know what's going to happen next because we're staying with the unfolding process. This side of our brain is much more both and. It's capable of holding paradox with some degree of comfort. It's sensitive to suffering. It values meaning more than happiness. And most of all, I think, is important to me, apart from the relational piece, is that it values individuality and uniqueness and connection the most. So maybe we can each get the feeling of that perspective if we recall times where we had a felt sense of deep connection with someone, or even a deep felt sense connection with nature, with the environment, with our planet. This kind of feeling that gets to a kind of still place and has this deep warmth to it, and this deep sense of the connection and the meaning that we have when we are with one another. The left hemisphere, on the other hand, has a different but equally important focus. And we could say that one of its jobs is providing stability. And it does this by taking what it receives from the right hemisphere, disassembling it so that it can use the pieces to create systems that we can rely on. But in the process, it renders what was flowing static and what was living dead. It has to freeze things in order to be able to take them apart and use them. It also values task and behavior over relationship. And this part is kind of important about the whole teaching of self-regulation, that the task of learning to self-regulate is how the left hemisphere would say it. But the right hemisphere instead would say, let's be together and let's co-regulate because we're always touching one another's brains and helping to shape them. So the left is about task and behaviors, and not so much relationship, because the relational circuitry doesn't live in the left hemisphere, it lives in the right. It has an either-or kind of way about it in order to gain clarity. It values judgments about what's good or bad. over the discomfort of paradox and not quite knowing what's going on. And as a result, it generates protocols and algorithms much more than being able to appreciate the kind of chaos of individuality and emergence. So what's missing from this perspective, if we think of just the left, is that there's no felt sense of we in the left hemisphere. So instead, what we have is this sense of I am alone, only we're not consciously aware of it for the most part. It's just underlies how we operate. So this piece is really important, this that we have no felt sense of we. I mean, imagine that feeling. And because we've all felt alone at times, we've all felt isolated, we've all felt like there's no one there with us. And when we are more in an isolated left hemisphere state, that's ongoing for us, even if we're with a lot of people. But again, it's below the level of conscious awareness. But it informs us. Ian talks about how the left hemisphere has a kind of ridiculous positive outlook on things. It thinks everything will come out all right. It believes the housing bubble will never burst, things like that. And at the same time, it also carries this sense of paranoia underneath it. And I've always wondered if that paranoia doesn't arise because of that sense of I am alone, which is not how we're meant to be in this world. So since our sense of meaning comes from our connections with others and with the larger world, there's really not much sense of meaning in the left hemisphere either, beyond getting what I want or what I want for me or for my small group. Ian calls it a more manufacturing mentality that really loses the human dimension. Again, just when we're just there in the left. And we can perhaps also remember times that when we ourselves have experienced that kind of functioning, where we feel quite cut off and isolated from human relationships and really poured into tasks and behaviors and that kind of thing. For myself, I recognize it when I'm busy with tasks, which I am, as we all are at times, and my daughter calls, and I experience it as an interruption rather than as an opportunity to connect. That tells me that I've lost contact with my right hemisphere that is so devoted to having these wonderful relationships. So I might even say to her, you know, I'm not in my right mind right now. So let me go pet the dog or walk outside a minute and I'll call you back so I can really connect with you. So we can begin to recognize these two ways in our common experience of relating to the world. So the left can sound like a very sterile place, and on its own it is, but when it's in relationship with the right hemisphere, there's a richness that emerges between the two. Ian's book is The Master and His Emissary, and by master there's no gender intended, but more of the role of being the one who's in the lead, and with the other being the emissary. And so the right hemisphere, when that's our perspective on the world, when we're into relating, into noticing what's happening between us, when we're feeling the aliveness of the present moment, that's what he would call, that's what we could know could be in the lead that would really help us to be able to be in relationship in ways that we can co-regulate one another, in ways we can attach, in ways that we can find meaning, when we can find support when we're troubled. But at the same time, if our left hemisphere has been well educated about how the right hemisphere operates, it can provide a kind of wisdom and steadiness for us to come in and where they come together so that the right is in the lead and the left is the emissary supporting with its wisdom. So that can sound kind of abstract. So let me talk about an example. Let's say that I'm with one of my clients and something touches an implicit memory and she becomes quite aroused, quite agitated. Because of our resonant circuitry, my own nervous system is going to feel that rise in sympathetic activation as well. And if I were to simply follow that emerging moment, it's possible that I'll become dysregulated right along with her. But this is where my left hemisphere could come in, and with an awareness of how the autonomic nervous system works, and with my memory arising of her history and what that is like, it allows me to open to why this activation makes sense, which is what the left hemisphere does, is make sense of things. And then there's a much greater likelihood that I'll be able to remain in my own regulation and then support her in the healing experience. So the two work together to provide both presence and then a kind of stable wisdom that give us just a little bit of distance from the actual experience so that we're not completely lost in it. It's extremely valuable to have these two things come together, and really has become the core of my work with people these days when we have year-long gatherings and we work on this over the course of the year, the integration of these two experiences. And by the end of the year, what I hear very often is, when I started, I thought I knew what it meant to be present with my clients. And by the time we're finished, I realized I didn't have any idea what that actually meant, because what it had meant was I was there in the room with them, but I was trying to help them, guide them, trying to fix them, trying to offer a lot from my own knowing rather than following them and being with them first and then allowing the healing process to kind of emerge almost on its own. So again, we probably have all had these experiences, and it's really an important thing for us to become a little more conscious of them, I think. And I've been working on it for years now and find that it's an ever-developing, emerging kind of felt sense that comes over time, so that I'm more aware now of when I slip into an isolated left hemisphere and pretty much am cut off from any kind of sense of connection or meaning, and then can make my way back bit by bit. So why this is important in terms of self-regulation is that we in the Western culture have taken a sharp turn into the left hemisphere dominance ever since the Industrial Revolution, since we moved away from the land and into cities more and more, since there's been a dominance of business and manufacturing over relating to nature. Some people hardly see a tree or a green plant through a day, you know. So rather than attending to our world from an more integrative perspective, we have a tendency to get trapped in that non-relational left hemisphere more and more frequently as we attend to tasks and behaviors, as we apply protocols and think about algorithms, as we focus on diagnosis and things like that, tends to push us into this more objective left hemisphere. There's some wonderful research by Barbara Fredrickson and her colleagues that suggests about 75% of us are living with the dominance of the left hemisphere on a regular, if not constant basis. So that's a lot. I mean, that's a whole lot. And the more frightened we become, and surely we are experiencing a lot of that in our culture now over these months leading up to the election, and now as we've moved through the election and now into this new phase of our country's and our globe's experience, there's a lot of fear, and fear tends to be so uncomfortable for us that one way we deal with that is to shift into the left hemisphere. So it's not surprising that along with all the cultural pieces that have arisen, that we also now have additional reasons to kind of separate ourselves from feeling so much and move into this more objective but really quite dead space. So when it comes to again, the experience of this, there's a felt sense of isolation when we're over there, isolated in the left, largely out of conscious awareness. Again, even if we're surrounded by people that we care about deeply. And it's tragic because there are consequences for both our mental and physical health and also our relational health. If you get really interested in this, you might want to look up Barbara Fredrickson's research about this. And there's also other pieces of research regarding the increase in narcissism and things like that, where we're finding that, again, there is this enormous retreat back into isolation inside ourselves that is just so central in our particular society right now. You may be able to tell I've got a little cold going on here, so I'm going to pop another little lozenge in my mouth to keep my throat okay. So I have water here too. So we don't have time to explore all those strands of research in ourselves, but you can certainly check into that if you get really interested about it. So how does this apply then to this whole conversation about self-regulation and co-regulation? With our relational circuitry out of reach when we're left dominant, The need to become emotionally self-sufficient seems self-evident to that hemisphere for us, and perhaps even urgent, like we better be able to do this because no one else is going to help us. Our left-centric viewpoint tells us that it isn't safe or even possible to rely on others. So we begin to retreat into doing things that help us cultivate a way that we can be on our own and be okay, which we really can't ever really do that very well, but we try so hard. And I think that this underlying experience of so much isolation is what in part drives the assumption that self-regulation is somehow healthier than ongoing co-regulation, and that the latter is merely something we do. The co-regulation is just something that's necessary to step into attaining ongoing self-regulation. So that's really quite powerful to imagine how we're being affected all the time by both the explicit and implicit messages that come from the left hemisphere. So when we carry this assumption about the importance of attaining self-regulation into our counseling rooms, we may have then an inherent preference for signs of a steady trend toward need for less and less support from us. And that isn't my experience of how healing works. I've been a trauma therapist for close to 30 years, and I've also been in my own deep process, which will continue till my last breath, I'm sure. But what I notice is that it's more of an undulating pathway where we need more support as we move into some implicit work where we're dealing with pain and with fear. And then as we emerge from that work, there's a period of integration where we don't need quite as much support. And then that prepares us to move into the next wave of the work, where again we need more support for ourselves while we are moving into this pain. We need another to hold us with their broader window of tolerance so that we can actually do the work. And what I've observed most of all is that even toward the end of a fairly long period of therapy, some of the most painful and frightening work happens right near the end, where again there's a need for this deepening support, which is then quite rich because we have this beautiful, intimate relationship at this point where our clients can really take us in as a source of comfort as they do this just very core kind of work. So that's one aspect of it. Another is that I hear many therapists talk about wanting to help their people learn to comfort themselves and parent themselves without much reliance on us as the therapist. If we haven't had the opportunity to have that circuitry of regulation built in relationship before, really we're asking people to do something that is not only a lot of work, but is much, much more difficult than using our natural circuitry of attachment and connection to be the source of comfort, and for us to be more in that role of providing the emotional parental support that the person didn't have. And a little while later, we're going to talk about how much this is true. So when we are asking people to move in a direction like that, where they're more taking care of themselves, we're really asking them to run against their core neurobiology. Out of our care for our people, when we go to teach them skills, we may be inclined to do it from a little more of an inner distance, lest our people become dependent on us. In fact, I had a conversation with a colleague this morning where he was talking about how at the very beginning of his training, his professor said, be sure that you're starting to plan for transition right at the first session because you don't want your people to become dependent on you. You want them to know that the goal is for them to get out there and be on their own, and that if you allow them to be dependent, you'll actually be harming them. Well, if we understand things about attachment difficulties, which most of the people that come to us certainly have attachment things that have happened to them that haven't gone particularly well, that we can understand that if there's going to be, just as a matter of course, periods when emotional dependency is what allows us to sink into these deeper areas of work and allow them to heal. But when we think again of self-regulation as the goal, it's much harder to go there, into this place where we're comfortable. It's also, the other thing is, if our needs for emotional dependency weren't met when we were small or later on in other relationships, it's harder for us to be willing to go there ourselves because it's pretty uncomfortable and begins to bring up our own kinds of things. Often I found that when my people come in, my clients, they have a strong sense that they have to learn how to regulate themselves because they've been criticized for being too needy, too emotional, too sensitive. I think the clear message many of us receive is get a hold of yourself, offered by well-meaning family and friends and others who've been influenced by this cultural implicit, which experiences self-reliance and self-regulation as an aspect of good character. So the messages are so powerful and so ongoing. So now with this kind of urgent need to foster self-regulation in mind, let's look at the neural circuitry to see if that actually makes any neurobiological sense at all. I think almost everyone these days, or at least maybe half of us, would agree at this point that early, warm, responsive relationships are absolutely necessary if the circuitry of regulation is to be built at all. We aren't born with any regulatory circuitry and isn't something we can do alone. We read about or hear about or feel into what it was like in the Romanian orphanages where there wasn't a co-person, a co-regulator with these children, and they're just disintegrated along every measure, from physical health to emotional health to the ability to connect. So we're absolutely dependent on one another at these very early stages. We need another well-integrated brain in resonance with ours to shape these connections between the certain prefrontal regions and the limbic system that provide this capacity for regulation. And there's probably also a lot of agreement that if we didn't have the kind of early experience that allowed this to develop, that the developmental process can happen later, perhaps in therapy or in a really warm marriage or a very deep friendship sometimes, with the support of responsive companions. So right there, many of us are on the same page, but then we come to this big fork in the road, where many to most would say that the goal is to become more and more independent of the need for such co-regulation. So that's where it takes us to begin to look at how the process of how this regulatory circuitry actually develops. We're all likely pretty familiar with the braiding between the prefrontal and the limbic that we were just talking about, but there's a second and often less familiar process that's happening at exactly the same time. And this is where we get to turn to the beautiful work of Marco Iacoboni about mirror neurons and resonant circuitry, and about a process of internalizing others that's happening side by side or right in the midst of this weaving together of the regulatory circuitry. So when we are with someone, so someone comes to us and we're here with them, and let's say I'm a little kid and here's my parent, and they come to us, what we begin to do is through mirror neurons and resonance circuitry, we begin to take in this other person. We know that we take in their emotional state in the moment. We know we take in their bodily sensations, and we know we take in their intention. At a minimum, likely we take in a lot more as mirror neurons are now being discovered throughout the brain and not only in certain areas where they were first found. So we probably take in a lot more than that. But that's a lot if we think about it. The emotional state of the person, their bodily sensations, and their intentions. In other words, mainly their implicit world. We're taking in their implicit world. But at the same time, we're also encoding what that person looks like, what they sound like, the quality of touch, of scent, and even of taste. I think of my darling daughter, Kate, chewing delicately on my fingers a lot when she was little, as part of what she was taking in from me is also what I tasted like. So we have this person now that we can see, we can hear, and that has all of this emotional richness that's now being encoded at the same time that we're encoding what our own experience is in that moment. So this warm person is coming to me and I'm having a wonderful experience in my body and in my emotions and all of that. And all of this becomes a single neural net, because what fires together wires together, and we begin to build an inner world that's made up of these dyads, or if there's more people there, larger groups. Sometimes if we have a long-term kind of training, we develop this sense of connection with the whole group that becomes a support. So we're getting built in this way so that we have with us at all times these people that we've internalized. So let's pause here for just a moment to sense the truth of that as we might be able to at this moment, and feel other warm ones who are within us. Begin to notice when we look inside whose faces we see that are smiling and that we have a sense of their presence and of their warmth that's with us in this very moment. as I do that, what comes up for me immediately is my 5th grade teacher, who was the first person I feel really saw me and understood me in such a profound way. And especially because we're here together and I'm doing this teaching, she's very close by right now, and I can really feel the warmth of her presence. She felt like a big pair of wings wrapped around me for the whole year. She was very demanding of us in terms of what we learned, but she also had this enormous heart, and I think she seemed to spot some of us that were having great difficulty at home and would just, again, wrap her motherly heart around us for the course of that year, and she's so much present here. And then there's a couple of other people to whom I am particularly close, one in a spiritual sense particularly, and one in a just a deep friendship sense, and I really can see their faces and feel their presence here supporting me right now as I'm doing this. So you may be also finding, as we're talking about this, that these internalized others begin to come to you as well. So as we build this wonderful inner community, what we're doing is building in co-regulation into our system for the rest of our lives. So we can pause and imagine how lovely that is, to think that we aren't just doing a mechanical action of weaving together some neural circuitry that then will hold our emotional state much better and our bodily state and all of that. We're actually taking in others to be with us. And that to me is a whole different feeling. So that's why I talk about this way, to say that self-regulation in a way really is a myth, because even the internal process that looks like self-regulation is co-regulation. And when we can become consciously aware of it, there is a kind of a warmth that comes to us that isn't there if we just think about, well, my circuitry is well put together. There is this sense of being able to be aware of being accompanied. And this helps us stay in a calmer state, and also with a greater sense of meaning, with a greater resilience in adversity, and all of that. So I'm quite taken by how the wisdom of our brains allows us to be accompanied all of the time. I think that when we're able to bring this perspective into our counseling rooms, it is really, really powerful, because it encourages us to be thinking about engaging in relationships that support internalization, as opposed to be teaching skills of self-regulation, which we can do from more of a distance, and which again have a little bit more of a protocolized kind of feel to them. But then it does if we imagine that we're engaging in relationships that support internalization. Steve Porges, who's one of my favorite people, our autonomic nervous system hero, is one to talk about this in some ways that is really, I think, very helpful. He talks about the passive pathways of co-regulation, whereby if I am in my social engagement system, in that ventral vagal parasympathetic, if I'm in that state, then I can provide a safe landing strip for others to come and join me in that ventral state, which is our preferred state. So if someone comes in sympathetic arousal and I'm able to stay in this more ventral state, they can begin to come into ventral too. And then together, we're internalizing one another and building this relationship at a very, very deep level. However, as the greater intimacy builds in the relationship, in the therapeutic relationship, it means there's going to very likely arise periods of emotional dependency as the younger parts of our clients come forward to receive what they needed when they were little but didn't get. So this calls on us to be very attentive to our own inner world so that we can be comfortable with these more intimate relationships. And hopefully we do that development with the support of others and don't try to do it on our own. That we don't need to self-regulate either. We can be with others who help us develop our regulatory circuitry. So I like this visual of these layers and layers and layers of support spreading out from any couple behind them, all these that are supporting them, you know, whether that couple's a therapeutic couple or friends or parent and child or, you know, whatever marriage, whatever it might be, that both people have these layers of support around them so that we have this opportunity to hold one another in these deep ways. So as we support this awareness of these inner others, again, we can have this deeply experienced feeling of being accompanied, which is just like honey, I think, for us, and also the source of what feels meaningful to us. So that's one way that co-regulation is always present. But even with these internal others, given external conditions and coupled with whatever unhealed implicit memories we might have, we are all vulnerable to being overwhelmed by stress, by pain, by fear fairly regularly. And this is the part where we need others on the outside. In a left-shifted society, the pressures of isolation and the constant striving for success exacerbate this need to have others with us because it so pulls us away from this core source of nourishment. So I think it can really help us if we humbly recognize that we human beings are fragile, we're tender, we're easily frightened, that we're also resilient and adaptive, and that with all of this, we are forever interdependent, and that that's a good thing. That's a good thing, and we can support the wisdom of turning to one another in challenging times rather than turning into isolation. So just breathing into that a bit and maybe sensing what our internal response is to that, to this idea of interdependence and that we always need one another. You know, if we haven't had much of a chance to experience that as children or to heal as adults, it can be really frightening to feel that degree of reliance on one another. And so that's why, again, it's so important that we attend to our own inner world with support so that we can develop an implicit world that actually values and can really settle into this sense of the beauty of interdependence and the necessity of it as well. So I want to share one other piece of science that I have found so supportive of this viewpoint about how important co-regulation is. Lane Becks and James Cohen offer us something called social baseline theory. And again, you can look these two men up if you would like to and read some more about this. I find it really helpful. And they are providing for us this really strong evidence of how co-regulation is actually built into our systems. And they do this with research where they essentially place someone in front of, or think about a very steep mountain when they're by themselves about climbing this mountain. And if the person is alone, that mountain looks really daunting and maybe even impossible. And then they bring in someone who's a stranger, but a safe stranger, but a companion. And now the mountain does not look quite so steep. And then if you bring in a trusted beloved, someone that you really feel secure with, suddenly walk up that mountain looks like a piece of cake. Now, it may not be quite that dramatic, but it's very noticeable how much either a task or mountain climbing or doing a difficult task or our perception of pain changes when we're accompanied. So our system is built to expect that someone will be with us to support us as we move through life. Our very neurobiology is built on that assumption, which I find wonderful. So what they began to look at then was they figured what was happening was that when someone came in, either a safe stranger or a trusted beloved came in, that what was happening was that our regulatory circuitry, orbital frontal, middle prefrontal region, was firing more strongly and calming the amygdala. When they looked at the scans, the opposite was happening. It was actually firing less. So this left them with quite a quandary. How can you be so much more regulated when actually the circuitry of regulation is working a lot less hard? So they looked a little deeper in the brain at the amygdala. And what happens is when we sense the arrival of someone who is going to support us and who we have a sense of safety and trust with, the amygdala quiets all on its own without needing to be regulated at all. And that just warms my heart. And it helps to explain why if I'm having a difficult time and someone I'm strongly connected with comes to be with me, I can feel my entire system begin to settle. Sometimes it's just a look on their face that they understand, not even words. And there's this quieting inside. And so that's our amygdala's calming, because what again, I think I said this a minute ago, but I want to repeat it again because it's so powerful. We have evolved to expect that we are embedded in a nest of warm relationships, And when we aren't, it's a violation to the most basic assumptions of our neurobiology. That's quite a statement, especially to hear it in a left-shifted world where the opposite assumption is what our systems feel, which is it's better to be on our own. So there's lots of other examples from neurobiology about how we're wired for this ongoing co-regulation with one another. But I'd like to take a little time, and I know I don't have a lot of time left. I'd like to end with a story that may help us feel our way into this a little bit more. And again, it also ties in with Steve Porges's work on the autonomic nervous system and Ian's work on the hemispheres. Just as a little side note, as early as 1994, Steve realized that the social engagement system, the ventral vagal parasympathetic, lateralizes to the right hemisphere. So to be a safe landing place for our people, we want to cultivate the leadership of the right and with the assistance of the left, because that's what helps hold us and helps us be in this ventral state that's so important to our ability to support the people who come to us. So here's my story. A friend who works with homeless men shared this experience with me a while back. For a long time, he'd been encouraging his street dwellers to drink more water because he was really worried that they were in danger of falling ill from the challenges of being so dehydrated. Because it's not something you easily remember out there on the streets when you're just worried about your survival. So he offered suggestions, he offered resources, he expressed his concern. And over time, he realized none of this was making any difference. In fact, what it seemed to be doing was creating shame when his men would come back and say that they still weren't doing as he'd asked. What they most often said was they just didn't remember to do it. They could recall it when he said it to them again. But then one day, one of his guys came in and he noticed he had a cracked lip probably from dehydration, and offered him a bottle of water while they talked. He simply gave it to him and they drank together. And I think of this as a kind of communion maybe. And the man left with the water bottle. And when he came back the following week, he was holding the bottle tightly and he said, "I drank at least twice as much water this week, and I thought about you every time. You really do want me to feel better, don't you?" So he asked his counselor, my friend, to refill the bottle before he left. When he left with this sacred water that was infused with the felt sense of the deepening relationship. They repeated this ritual every single time they met. And after a few weeks, he said that this water bottle was his most prized possession. And it just brings tears to my eyes. I'm here. They had managed to find a way to be together with it. So this was not an intervention to get him to do something. This was a human response to this man who was clearly suffering from dehydration. And over time, as my friend has thought about it, he realized when he was teaching him a skill, he was a little more anxious, so probably a little more sympathetically activated and not in a place to be joining and co-regulating with him. And maybe in a little more left-centric space as he was trying to teach him something, trying to pass on information to try to get behavior change to happen. So when this intent to teach and to control comes out of our need to make something change, it pulls us out of ventral and then doesn't leave us in a place where we can co-regulate. So when he instead offered this bottle out of his human concern, it opened the doorway from his ventral state to invite a ventral state in this person where they could co-regulate and where he could internalize his therapist more deeply, his counselor much more deeply. And this drinking together, it's an entirely different neural event than it is in teaching a skill out of our own a bit anxious need to get something to change. So it's an amazing thing to see how this might happen and even lead to him having a deeper sense of the caring of his therapist because they were body to body, heart to heart, and behavior, action to action as they drank together. He was able to take in the felt sense experience of the care rather than maybe having more of a I know he cares about me. It was the feeling of he cares about me. So then even when he is back out on the streets and he's using this water bottle, he's no longer drinking alone because he's internalized the water bottle along with the experience of actually being with this person. My friend said that he felt that something different was happening for him as well, that he found his street dweller coming to his mind more and more often during the week and thinking about him drinking the water. So in this beautiful tale of their co-internalization of each other, we have this beautiful way that the water bottle and the drinking of the water gets encoded together with the relationship. And as that happens, then these two men are remembering each other and are with each other even when they're not together. I know my friend had no intention of trying to change behavior when he did this, but was simply having that responsive moment. And these human acts of sharing arise in these right-centric, more ventral times when our systems are really open to responding to one another in the emerging moment, and that this lays the groundwork for the ongoing relationship. So I hope as we've talked about this, we can, all of us, including me, begin to get a sense that this co-regulation goes on all of the time, and that when we become more conscious of it, it becomes this beautiful, warm bath for us at all times of being accompanied, and helps us stay again in this relationship between the right-centric awareness of connection and then bringing in the wisdom of the left hemisphere, rather than feeling culturally pushed off more into a dominant left hemisphere kind of way. So let's finish up for just a moment by again going back to and allowing and inviting to come one or two people that we carry inside, that just the remembrance of them bathes us in this beautiful warmth and this sense of connection. May you be richly accompanied every day of your life.
Bonnie, thank you so much. I can feel the warm field of interconnection that you've invoked through this presentation. I would say a presentation that focuses on what you call relational neuroscience, not just neuroscience. And I'm curious about that. Is that term relational neuroscience, where that comes from?
Well, it seems like but whether we're talking about Jaak Panksepp and affective neuroscience, emotional neuroscience, and that's very relational, or what's my primary roots are interpersonal neurobiology, Dan Siegel, Alan Shore, Lou Cozzolino, and then now it's spread out to so many others as well. You know, those of us standing on the shoulders of those giants who are getting to pursue this each in our own individual way. And then there's also all of the social neuroscience, and then there's the researchers like social baseline theory guys, Bex and Cohen, and all of that. So I was just trying to find a term that might be big enough to house all of those. And so I just call it relational neuroscience, to try to embrace all of these strands that are arising in the neuroscience world that talk to us about how we are shaping one another's brains all the time, every moment.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've done, I think, a brilliant job in this presentation on showing us that how self-regulated we are is really a myth. But what I want to talk about a little bit is why there's such an investment in self-regulation. And you've pointed to this left brain dominance that we have in our culture. And there's more I want to talk about. I mean, I think a lot of people have a fear of, you could say, dependency or codependency. I don't want to be codependent in my intimate relationship and always have to rely on co-regulation. I want to also be differentiated and autonomous. And I certainly don't want to be dependent on my therapist. That's terrifying to me. I'm going to pay them for the rest of my life. So how would you address these fears of dependency, and how do you distinguish between dependency and, healthy co-regulation?
It's a very important question, because it's really easy to slip over into that fear, especially if people have not been reliable for us when we're younger. Then it's terrifying. And then we have to find all kinds of ways to talk ourselves out of even interdependence kind of thing. I think the main thing that I am saying here is that what appears to be self-regulation is really is how co-regulation is built into us, so that we look self-regulated on the outside, maybe a fair amount of the time, but we're really having internal relationships. And those come from us relating to others in this deep, vulnerable way, where we're heard and seen and valued, again, with a therapist, with a lover, with a friend, with whoever it might be, where we have these very vulnerable moments where we join with them and then take them into us so that they remain to regulate us on the inside. So there is a process to me in being seen and heard that creates a stronger sense of my own self as well, so that I am differentiated, but I'm differentiated within the we that's happening. And if you think about babies, that's what happens. There's all this merging that happens, and out of that begins to come a little person as their being is reflected by the parent. So the parent sees their little one is like, oh, you look sad right now. And this child begins to get a sense of their own sadness inside and like, that's me. And I was just recognized. So we can't develop a sense of I and an awareness without the reflection of others. And this is as true when we're adults as it is when we're little. So we develop that, and then that I begins to develop that feels confident in knowing their own insides because it's been reflected to them, also internalizing that person for accompaniment because that feeling is just vital. And then we go down the road looking fairly self-regulated with moments when we aren't. And then hopefully we have the confidence that we can reach into connection and even vulnerability and even feeling weak and sad and grief-stricken and be surrounded by the care and know that we'll emerge from it back into ourselves as well.
Now, what about when you're working with somebody who has had a difficult childhood, maybe neglect or some other kind of developmental trauma, and the idea that they're going to lean in to this co-regulation is just, they're too terrified of that. What kinds of approaches and orientations do you think are helpful?
Well, I think the most important thing is for me to be a safe presence. Steve Porges says, safety is the treatment. And for me to be safe, as my person comes into the room, the most important thing I can offer them is a space in which I welcome them without judgments, without agendas, and without expectations, just open to who they are in this moment, which is a description of that right-centric ventral vagal space. That's safety for a person, to know that they will be received if they're angry, if they're sad, if they have to push me far, far away, if they want me to sit clear across the room from them, that I will just be with them exactly as they are in this moment. Because that's what we lacked mostly as children, was any kind of responsive other who could meet us where we actually were and see us, hear us, reflect us, hold us, while we discovered more about our own inner world. So that is my main task as a therapist, I believe, is to establish that kind of an environment. And then as that person brings whatever it is that comes with them that day, whatever that might be. Maybe they come in and they're just really irritated with me from something that happened last time that somehow we didn't surface at that time, but they got irritated along the way. And to feel as warmly welcomed in their irritation as they would if they were coming in smiling. And to welcome and be curious about that irritation. And then as I'm flowing with them and following them, it will come to me about how I might meet them there, so that then I might become more active and, offering something. But first comes receptivity, because that's what feels safe to us. I think any of us can reflect on that. If I'm really upset and I come to somebody and the first thing they try to do is fix me or change me, I just want to walk away. I don't want that. I want to be seen and held. I want to be known. I want to be felt. And then we can move on to whatever might be next. So I think it's creating the safety of the environment first and foremost is what allows people to begin to discover that it might be safe to approach. Because remember, our ventral is primary. And if there's safety somewhere in a joined system of two people, the other person's system is going to gradually move toward ventral also.
Now, you mentioned that it's, you think, not a correct idea to focus on self-regulation as a goal for the psychotherapy process and the way that we think of self-regulation. And I'm curious to know, throughout the psychotherapeutic process, if co-regulation and the valuing of this internal community is the goal, how that changes your sense of the trajectory, if you will. You talked about this undulating process. How might there be different markers, if you will, of a successful progression in therapy?
It's a really interesting question, because I think the first thing it does is change the feeling in the room. if I have determined that self-regulation is our goal, first of all, I'm not following the other person. I don't know if that's their goal. I want to know what it is they're needing. So first of all, I'm taking the lead. And when I take the lead, it tends to promote a little bit of sympathetic activation and a little bit of distance, which does not necessarily feel safe to the person. So if I come in with something I'm going to share or teach or a skill I'm going to offer without finding out first where this person is and what they actually need in the moment, it's going to change a lot in the room. So there's that piece of the initial approach in receptivity of the person. And then if I'm thinking in terms of co-regulation, it has a tendency to make me be more willing to offer my being and presence to this person in ways that have, this is where we get into words like boundaries and all of that have very permeable boundaries. And depending on the developmental stage of the person, they may feel their relationship differently with me. To give you a very extreme example of a person who was literally hated from as soon as, probably from conception, but at least from when the mother knew she was pregnant. So came into this world feeling like an it and a terrible thing, just a thing, not a person at all. And as we began to work our way back toward the depth of anguish that this causes, even in the womb, she began to have the sensation as though she were actually in my womb. She began to feel that way, like she was being carried in this watery world that was somehow inside of me. And I think as a gift of me having had pretty astounding abuse as a child and being working on it my whole life, pretty much since my mid-40s when I finally had a really good therapist, I think as a result of that, it was really easy for me to take that on and for me to share with her that feeling that I was carrying her as, this not even born child, and to feel privileged by that. And over time, there was this sense of birth and this sense of growing and this sense of development and this sense of moving more outward in the world and all of that. But what she said to me toward the end of our work together was, I will always have the experience of being loved in the womb. And yet she went on to become, very internally co-regulated, I would say, at a deeper level than most people are actually, because she was able to go through that in utero process consciously. She said, I felt welcomed into the world for the first time in my life.
How do you think this teaching, becoming internally co-regulated, changes how a therapist seeks support for their own process?
Boy, I just hope that's what happens, because I know as I go out and speak with people or just, whoever I'm talking to with colleagues, sometimes I'll offer an idea like that about the necessity of support. And often somebody will say, well, couldn't I do it this way, which is a way that they would do it on their own? Can't I do self-care? And it's like, well, that's fine. You can do self-care, but it's not going to bring you the full benefits of co-regulation, because when you're doing self-care, you're not internalizing another person to go on down the road with. So it seems to me that it becomes, actually, it made me have a memory of a class at Portland State University where we were talking about helping our clients develop more compassion toward themselves. And I said something about, and it's really so important that we feel compassionate toward ourselves. And one woman's hand shot up and she said, I never, ever thought of applying that to myself. So we have a tendency to want to offer all these good things. But again, living in this left-shifted culture, partly the way we're trained, partly evidence-based practice, protocols, all this stuff has pulled us so far away that it doesn't even cross our mind to seek support. So I constantly talk with people, with everybody near me, and talk to myself as well to make sure that we have these layers of support, that we have perhaps our own therapy, a best friend. I have a very close friend. I talk to her almost every day, but our talking to each other amounts to mainly listening to one another and just holding each other wherever we are. And it's enormously helpful for me to have that resource doing the kind of work I do,
Now,
So
just to,
I don't know if I answered your question.
you did. It sounds like you're a big enthusiast of psychotherapists reaching out for actual human being support in other people and not going it alone in some form.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's essential if we're going to do this well for a long time and not, at our own expense in some way. I think it's absolutely vital. And so I'm doing my best to help there be cultivated groups of people who are mainly listening partnerships, who listen to one another and share with each other. And the idea isn't to fix or give ideas about this or that kind of thing unless they're requested, but mainly just to be heard. And I actually stole this in part from Patty Whiffler of she's Hand in Hand Parenting by Connection. Her new book is called Listen, interestingly enough, and she does this with parents, where she pairs up parents while the kids are with kids that are struggling, pairs up parents that can just hear one another, and the changes in the family environment are astounding when the mother feels heard by somebody who can actually really understand because she's going through similar things. So I stole this idea of listening partnerships from Patty with her permission.
Mm-hmm. Now, just a couple more questions for you, Bonnie.
Sure.
You mentioned mirror neurons, and I think that many of us know that mirror neurons play this important role in empathy and compassion. But in your practice as a psychotherapist, how does your understanding of mirror neurons affect how you are, how you practice? What are the actual practical implications of this understanding of mirror neurons?
Well, it makes it be really important to me that I'm minding my own internal health, because I know that I know that not only is my state in the moment being mirrored to the person, but that how they're taking me on internally and so that I can walk down the road with them is going to depend a lot on my own health. Now, part of my health that's really important to me is recognizing that with secure attachment or in any kind of secure relationship, we get our empathic offering right on the first try about 33% of the time. And all the rest is rupture and repair. So what's important to me is to have the humility to recognize when there's been a rupture as best I can, that I'm in a good enough state that I can read the other person's face and body and go like, something just happened there. I wonder what just happened, so that we can have a repair. So instead, this isn't about my own mental health is not nearly so much about being perfect, but about accepting with great humility how very imperfect I am and being willing to be present with my imperfections and the ruptures that happen between us so that we can continue to work toward repairs, because that's optimal and that's what actually builds security. Not primarily getting it right on the first try, but it's coming back to repair the ruptures.
Mm-hmm. Now, twice in your presentation, you had us bring to mind an inner figure that provides us with warmth and support. And I'm curious if you think this is the kind of inner contemplation that it's worthwhile to do regularly. And are there a certain number of inner figures? Like, what if somebody has just one? I only have one. Or what if I don't have one?
Yeah, maybe you just have a group of trees out in a forest somewhere. I think all of us probably bonded with something, a dog, a tree, a particular meadow. I have a particular meadow that I'm very fond of as part of my inner community, and a river and a bridge. I have those things as well as the people. It's really quite all right to have one dominant person or one dominant experience that fed us in that way. I've had maybe in all these years a dozen people that didn't have any of that, period. And then I became that for them. If we don't have someone, then we need to find someone who can be with us in a deeply intimate, vulnerable relationship so that we can begin to build that world. I think it's just essential. Otherwise, we feel alone or at the mercy. Because here's the other half that we didn't talk about, Tammy, and that is we also internalize the people that are painful for us. And so if all we have is that in there, boy, we really need to have these others as a support to begin to work with the ones that are in the ones we've internalized who are in pain so that they can be resolved as well.
Mm-hmm. And just one final question for you, Bonnie. It's obvious to me that this topic, and you said in the very beginning that this is a provocative topic, is important to you. that you're making
Yes.
a statement by saying we need to look at this myth of self-regulation that is a rallying cry in our left brain dominant culture. What I'd
Yeah.
love to know is why this is so important to you and what you feel the implications are if we start recognizing that it's a myth.
Well, I think that because the roots of self-regulation and the importance of it as like a moral virtue lie in this left dominance, and kind of keeps us locked over there where it's really a miserable state physically and mentally and emotionally in the long run. So it's partly for that reason that I feel so passionate about this, because if we're going to have a humane world, if we're going to have ways that we are able to hold one another, that we can develop the capacity to feel into what our environment needs and feel the capacity into what our different communities need, we need to be recognizing and really focusing on this. I think it's so important to me because I grew up in a household with a deeply mentally ill mother and a father who simply couldn't cope with her at all. And like I said, my first person that I feel like I strongly internalized was my fifth grade teacher on the positive side. She changed my life. I know the value of this. And I've always known, I taught, before I was a therapist, I was a college prof. And I know I was that because I wanted to keep Miss Nelson close to me. She was my teacher. So I know from personal experience the value of this and the depth of healing that just being with her for 9 months gave me, and the hope that it gave me. So when we have these profoundly internalized, warm relationships, they give us ground to stand on every day, and also hope for the world being able to be a more loving, caring place where the focus isn't on tasks, behavior, success, money, getting, spending, but is instead on how can we be with one another and care for our planet as we care for one another.
Well, I'm going to lean into the full network of support here and thank everyone for being with us and listening, and also thank our Sounds True staff for
Mm-hmm.
being here and being part of this support network. And Bonnie, I really want to thank you for being the presenter teacher here for our first Sounds True Psychotherapy Masterclass. Thank you for your warmth and your brilliance.
Well, thank you, Tammy, for entertaining the conversation. I appreciate the work you do. It sounds true more than I could possibly tell you.
Thank you. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, very soon we'll be releasing a new one-year training called The Leading Edge of Psychotherapy. The purpose of The Leading Edge of Psychotherapy is to bring together the world's foremost psychotherapy educators to present a series of intensive online training offerings, the latest, most critical information for practicing therapists today. During the first year of the leading edge of psychotherapy, there will be included 4 separate trainings, and Bonnie Badenoch will start off this year-long program with a 10-week course on trauma and the embodied brain, a heart-based training in relational neuroscience for healing trauma. Again, thanks everyone for joining us today, and also please look out for another masterclass coming soon, this time with Stan Tatkin on state-dependent memory, perception, and communication, how we all get it wrong. On behalf of Sounds True, thanks again for being with us, and we'll see you at our next masterclass. SoundsTrue.com, many voices, one journey. Thanks for being with us.